Time to mix. First, I need you to pick some reference tracks. 1 to 3 tracks that are in line with your desired outcome. If you're mixing for someone else, definitely 2 or 3 tracks would be ideal. If you're mixing your own work, sometimes 1 reference track can be enough. Reference tracks will give you a ton of information about your speakers or headphones, your listening environment, as well as information about certain details of your mix that we are gonna see in a moment. Pick something that is truly in line with your arrangement and desired outcome. If you're mixing bombastic trailer music, there's no point having a 90s reference track like Jurassic Park. Vice versa, if your track is traditional with a wide dynamic range and it's inspired to the soundtracks of the 80s or 90s, there's no point having a bombastic reference from a recent Hans Zimmer soundtrack. When mixing for another composer, reference tracks are also important because they give you and the other person a shared understanding of what's bright, what's dark, what's quiet, what's loud, and so on. You need to make an important decision. Are you going to bounce everything to audio or mix the session as it is with all your virtual instruments open? I suggest that you watch the whole module before giving your final answer to this question. Audio stems give you more flexibility for mixing. So, ideally, if you're 100% happy with the arrangement, you can bounce everything to audio and import all the tracks into your mixing session. On the other hand, if there's any possibility that you will need to make changes later on, for example, because the music in question was made for a client who can always ask for an edit at some point, then it's best to just rename the arrangement session and mix with all the virtual instruments working in the background. It's good practice to open your virtual instruments before mixing or before bouncing to audio and deactivate the built-in reverbs. Follow this process step by step and you will be fine. Balance the levels of your track. By that I mean that you must bring all the volumes down to 0. Go to the busiest section of the track. Bring the main instrument up so you can hear it well, and then bring in all the supporting instruments one by one in order of importance. Obviously, the main instrument might well change throughout the track. Therefore, you need to change the balance as the track evolves. The violins might be the main instrument in section A. The horns could be the main instrument in section B. Use volume automation or make duplicates of the instrument with custom volumes, because different portions of the track will have to have their custom balance. It's crucial that you start from the busiest section first, the part of your tune where there are more instruments or where the instruments are playing louder. This way you'll make space for everything. If you start from the intro and it's a calm intro, you will fill the mix with the few elements that make the intro, and by the time new instruments kick in, you won't have any more space. The solution is not to EQ or compress the hell out of some instruments to squeeze them in. The solution is to try and get the balance right, and to get as close as possible to your ideal mix by tweaking the volumes alone. So, in this initial phase, you will be worrying only about volume and nothing else. And for each portion of the track, you will establish a clear hierarchy with your main instrument, let's say the horns for example, in the spotlight, then the rest of the brass for example slightly below that level so that it's clearly audible but it doesn't cover the horns, then the strings, then the percussion, and then the woodwinds. It is okay to group the sections of the orchestra into bus groups so that you can bring the strings or woodwinds or percussion or brass down or up as a whole. Now, if you were working on a different genre, I would actually suggest that you keep all the mono signals panned to the center at this stage, leaving the panning for later. It's good practice for general mixing, but with orchestral recordings and virtual instruments, things usually come in pairs of microphones and have a stereo image of their own, so you'll have to work with stereo signals. It's okay, you'll just focus on the balance nonetheless. If you do have any mono inputs, let's say you recorded yourself playing the violin or the classical guitar, or some vocals, definitely keep those tracks centered for now. If you're uncertain about some of the volume hierarchies, let's say you have those main horns, but are unsure whether the second instrument should be the rest of the brass or the strings, try both. Try different balances. Bring all volumes back to zero and start from scratch a few times until you get the balance that works. It'll save you so much time in the long run. Also, listen to your references and pay attention to the volume relationships between the different instruments. Your reference tracks provide a lot of useful information for each phase of the mixing process. It's normal for an instrument to have different volume levels throughout the tune. For example, you might have a piano on its own at the beginning of the tune and then piano plus orchestra later on. Well, most likely that piano will have to have different volume settings for the two situations. You can use volume automation. You can create a duplicate track treating those two piano instances as different entities, or you can slice up the audio if you bounce to audio first and adjust the clip volumes. This is likely to happen for many of the instruments in an orchestral mix, and it's the key to a crisp, well-balanced sound. The second thing that you're gonna do, which is also the second most important thing overall, is panning. Panning allows you to place things across the stereo image. And in the context of orchestral mixing, panning also allows you to work on the stage placement of all instruments. Ultimately, we want to achieve clarity in our mix, but we also want to try and recreate what happens in a real orchestral recording. Virtual instruments these days are already panned. Your first violins to the left, cellos to the right, and so on. But we should take into account the following things. Some of the instruments might require panning from scratch, because the samples, even though they are a stereo signal, sound centered. If you are combining samples from different libraries, they might have been placed on the virtual stage using different criteria. All solo instruments require custom panning anyway. You might want to adjust the panning of those instruments that are already placed on the virtual stage. For example, your first violins that sound mostly left could go even more to the left, or they could be slightly more centered, depending on the track and many other factors. In order to decide where you should place the instruments, you can use your taste, you can check your references, and you can look for orchestral layout pictures online. Pictures of real orchestras will show you that more than one placement is possible, but also that the most popular types of stage placements share some common features. Reference tracks are also really important because some mixes have a very wide image, some other mixes don't. It's an important stylistic decision that you need to make for each mix. Before proceeding, check the pan law settings in your DAW because they affect the whole process. I usually set mine to -3 dB. Because we are working with stereo tracks, the traditional panner that's built into your DAW's audio tracks or instrument tracks is not the right tool for the job. It would in fact lose some of the stereo information as you move things across the stereo field. Instead, you must use a stereo panner that allows you to collapse the stereo image if needed and place things accurately without losing any stereo information. I use VSL PowerPan, but you can look for alternatives from Waves or other companies. If you're mixing with your virtual instruments open, that's if you didn't bounce the audio, you can open the sampler and see if it has a built-in stereo imager. Whenever you change the positioning of an instrument, you will affect its volume as well. It's paramount that you preserve the balance achieved in the previous phase of the mixing process. You can use the volume slider in your panning plugin to increase or lower the volume of the pan track so that it matches what it was before. Double check by temporarily bypassing the panner and make sure that the perceived volume is the same as before panning. Don't use the solo function while panning. Listen in context as you move things across the stereo field and hear how everything is affected. It doesn't matter how processing affects the sound of an instrument on its own. It only matters what it does in the context of the whole mix. Use this guideline to avoid getting lost. Pan the solo instruments first, if present, then the strings, then the woodwinds, brass and percussion. Panning automation is a thing as well. One instrument might have different panning settings in different sections of a mix. For example, a piano on its own can occupy the whole stereo image, but maybe you want to make it slightly narrower when other instruments are playing, or even move it slightly to one side. Again, you can write automations for your panning plugin, or you can create a duplicate track. By the time you're done with the panning, your mix should sound reasonably good. The next steps will refine and strengthen the good work that you've done in these first two crucial phases. Definitely aim to get a good sound out of balance and panning alone before moving on. You can use the EQ to take care of problematic frequencies. You can use EQ to make something sound brighter or darker. You can use EQ to make things more or less distant. Remember that you should EQ in context. There's no point isolating an instrument and working for hours on its EQ settings. Sorting out the low end should be your biggest priority. Decide which group of instruments will occupy most of the low end, usually the percussion, sometimes the low strings. You need to pick one of the two as the main low instrument. You can try either of them if uncertain, but you need to make a choice. Draw inspiration from your references as usual. This doesn't mean that you will high-pass everything else. Whilst that could be fine in other types of music, high-passing the orchestral sections might result in an empty, unnatural sound. Opt instead for a low shelf or a bell. Carve out some of the lows from the strings, making space for thunderous percussion, or trim the lows from the drums, making space for the double basses, depending on the arrangement. You can get rid of a bit more lows from the woodwinds and brass, but always use your judgment and find a balance between a clear sound and a full organic sound. High pass can be useful for some of the metallic percussion that have unnecessary low end, and even for the piano, especially if it's accompanied by other instruments. Generally, there's no need to boost any lows, especially from modern virtual instruments that sound very full already. Some of the most problematic resonances are found in the lows and lower mids, between 30 and 400 Hz. The percussion can present very boomy resonances. The strings can have resonances from the bow itself in the 100 to 300 Hz region. The brass and sometimes the woodwinds can present annoying resonances in that area as well. It changes from library to library. Use a bell EQ to tame those resonances, but take frequent breaks and listen to your references as well, because you only want to remove the problematic frequencies just enough to improve the overall clarity. If you overdo it, you might end up denaturing the sound, because for many instruments, that's also the region where the body of the sound is. You might also find resonances in the 500 Hz to 2K region and up. Again, trust your ears, listen to the references and EQ in context. Don't carve out instruments just because you think you have to. 2 to 6K is an area where a lot of energy can be found for the percussion and strings. So if you ever need to tame some low strings that sound gritty, you can locate the grit somewhere in that region of the spectrum and then do a very gentle scoop. I'd go for a wider bell in this case. Rarely necessary anyway. On the other hand, if you want to bring up some aggression from the drums, you can do gentle boosts in that area, but again, be considerate. Also, sometimes the strings, especially the high strings, can have a very harsh sound around 6K. Largely depends on the samples, the arrangement and the dynamics. If that happens, you can carve out the nastiness with a targeted, more or less narrow bell EQ. Boosting or cutting the highs does not only make an instrument brighter or darker, it also affects its perceived distance. More on this later when we talk about reverb. For now, I only want you to worry about the clarity of the mix, and let's be honest, orchestral composers who use samples are very lucky because most libraries sound bright and crisp, so there's very little you have to do in this area of the spectrum. Sometimes you want to emphasize the brass sizzle, and you can do that by boosting around 8K, but there are better ways to go about this, and we'll see them in a moment. Check the reference tracks to see if your instruments sound bright enough. Whenever you're EQing an instrument, you want to match the volume at the end. Move the EQ's volume slider to increase the volume if you made subtractive EQ, or to lower the volume if you boosted some frequencies. Compare the EQ'd version of the sound with the unprocessed version by switching the bypass button on and off. You want to preserve the balance achieved in phase 1. EQ automations are very important. Either write them or make track duplicates as usual. Imagine a solo piano intro that has more or less the full spectrum, and then a second EQ'd piano with less low frequencies when the whole orchestra comes in. A case for automation is also that different articulations sometimes come with different tones. Therefore, if you have one segment of the tune where the violas play only staccato and a different segment where the violas play long notes, you might need tailored EQ for each one. If you band instruments that have a lot of energy in the low end, the low strings for example, or some big drums, something very common in orchestral mixing as your reference tracks will confirm, you may want to roll off some of the lows from those instruments, because hard pan lows are overwhelming and you don't need as much low-end presence on the sides for it to be noticeable. I know this is a lot of information on EQ alone, but I want to stress the fact that you shouldn't do anything for the sake of it. It's not like I always cut my brass around 250. That's not how it works. Once you're done balancing and panning, you need to listen to your mix, compare it to the references, see if there are any issues and address those issues. Certain things are better addressed by EQing a whole group of instruments. Case in point, rolling off some lows from the strings, brass and woodwinds to make space for the drums. Some other things require that you intervene on the individual instrument. If uncertain, start by EQing the groups, which allows you to make big changes with very small moves, and then go at a more microscopic level only if your ears tell you that you must. A compressor can do many things. In the context of orchestral mixing, we mostly, but not only, compress for one of the following three reasons. We want to reduce the dynamic range of an instrument or a section. We want to tame the attack of an instrument or a section. We want to bring up the attack of an instrument or a section. The first scenario is very common. We have some timpani hits that poke through the mix too much every now and then, just to give you an example, and we want more control over their dynamics. In order to reduce the dynamic range of an instrument, your compressor should have a very fast attack and a slow release time. Set the threshold so that you get between 0.5 and 3 dBs in gain reduction. You can push harder if necessary, as long as it doesn't sound too obvious in the mix. Compressing whole sections is great, but it tends to sound more obvious, so you might want to be careful with the gain reduction if you're compressing a section, and you can push more if you're compressing one instrument. Same with the ratio. You might want to use gentler ratios on groups, but you can be more aggressive on single instruments. Second scenario, we are trying to make an instrument less snappy and bring up the body of the sound, the sustain or the room. In order to tame the attack of an instrument, you need a compressor with a fast attack time and a fast release time. This way, only the initial transient is going to be pushed down by the compressor, and the rest won't be affected. Sometimes, the percussion as a whole can benefit from this type of compression. It's a stylistic preference. Third scenario, we have an instrument that we want to make snappier on purpose. In order to bring up the attack of an instrument, you need slow attack times and slow release times. This will allow the transients to come through, whilst the body of the sounds will be compressed. This also reduces the room component of a sound and makes the instrument more upfront. So, in the first scenario, we are mostly fixing problems, trying to control dynamics without doing any more volume automations. Scenario 2 and 3 are more about tonal shaping. How do we proceed in practice? Do we compress everything? Do we leave everything untouched? Do we compress only groups? Should we just compress the drums? Here's an approach you can use. Once you're done with the balance, panning and EQ, you listen to the mix once again and see if the dynamics need some extra attention. If that's the case, you can do some micro volume automation, you can use compression, or both. Then you need to make an artistic decision whether some of the instruments require tonal shaping, such as bringing up or down their attack. The style of your composition will largely determine this aspect. Once again, your reference tracks can guide you. For example, the percussion section in orchestral soundtracks from the 80s and 90s sound very natural and almost unprocessed, whereas stuff like Two Steps from Hell has drums with more controlled transients. I'm not saying that compression is only for the drums, but in the context of an orchestral mix, instruments that have a lot of transient information, such as the percussion and some keyboards, might be the ones you want to compress first. Whereas for the strings or the winds, especially if they're playing long notes, small volume automations can help you control the dynamics in a more natural way. Also, compressing at more levels in a cascade fashion can be very helpful sometimes. You can compress a group of instruments gently and then go to some of the instruments that feed into that bass group and compress them individually if needed. This way, you'd be compressing at more stages and it's gonna sound better because each compressor is only doing a tiny bit of gain reduction. Remember that you should compress in context and not in solo. My advice is also to match the gain of the compressed track manually instead of using the makeup gain function. Last but not least, some virtual instruments are already compressed and processed in other ways. If they sound good already, there's no need to tweak them further. You need a good convolution reverb, which will be your main reverb for orchestral mixing, and a good algorithmic reverb, which will be used on occasion for solo instruments or things that need that extra tail. Convolution reverbs use impulse responses from real places and allow you to recreate realistic ambiences, whereas algorithmic reverbs are based entirely on mathematical models and might sound less realistic but offer you more flexibility. Virtual instruments can be dry or wet. Dry instruments are recorded in spaces with little reflections. Wet instruments are recorded in bigger studios. With dry instruments, you normally get just one signal. Wet instruments usually offer you a variety of close and distant microphones. In addition to that, most sample libraries have built-in reverbs which load up when you select an instrument and make it sound more pleasant out of the box. It's good practice to deactivate the built-in reverb before mixing or before bouncing to audio. What if you're using samples from different libraries and you wind up with a combination of dry samples, wet samples, also samples that were recorded in completely different spaces? Traditionally, the answer would be to make everything dry. In other words, to find a minimum common denominator between all libraries by removing all the room mics and using only the closed mics. In this scenario, where the whole sound is made of dry signals or closed mics, a convolution reverb would be used to recreate the ambience entirely. This approach is fine, but it's not the only way to go about this. Distant mics and room mics are not just reverb. They carry a lot of the character of the sound, so my advice is to take all sample libraries for what they are and use the wet signals as well. If the balance and all the other aspects of the mix are right, you can use a convolution reverb to glue everything together at the end and you'll be fine. If it doesn't work, then sure, go back and use just the dry signals, but in most cases that won't be necessary. If you're mixing with your MIDI session open and all the virtual instruments running in the background, you have access to all the microphones at all times. If you'd rather bounce to audio, you can do one of the following 3 things. You can bounce each microphone for each instrument separately. It gives you max flexibility, but you end up with many tracks. You can bounce all microphones for each instrument into just one audio track. Super straightforward, but you have less room for tweaking. For each instrument, you can bounce the closed microphone into one audio track and then all the other microphones into another track. This way you'll have 2 tracks for every instrument, one dry and one wet. Pick the approach that inspires you the most, or try them all and decide what works for you. The quickest way to add reverb to your orchestra is to create an effects channel with your convolution reverb 100% wet and then send your sections to that reverb with a post-fader send. This way you'll have just one virtual space to worry about and a few send levels to tweak, one for each section of the orchestra. This allows you to make whole sections drier or more reverberated with a few touches, but you don't have control over the reverb levels for each instrument. Alternatively, you can send your instrument tracks individually to the convolution reverb. We're still talking about one single reverb channel per mix, but the sends happen at a single audio track level rather than a bus group level. This is more time consuming and you won't be able to make big changes fast, but you'll have more control over what happens. The first method works in many cases. The main downside is that reverbs make the low end more prominent. So you might have to do some corrective EQ on the groups to compensate for that, which is fine. Or you might have to adjust the volume of some of the low-range instruments, which is fine too. Especially if you work with wet samples, which means that you don't need that much reverb, these adjustments are usually very small. With the second method, you can keep the low-range instruments a bit drier on purpose, which might result in a punchier low end. Perhaps less realistic, but it might be what you're going for. My advice, nonetheless, is to rely mainly on the first method. It goes without saying that any reverb changes should be done in context, whilst hearing all the instruments, and that adding reverb to a sound will increase its volume. Therefore, once you've found the right reverb send level for an instrument or group, you might have to adjust its volume to restore the balance achieved in phase 1 of the mix. EQing the reverb channel is also possible. And if you have experience producing other types of music, such as pop, EDM, etc., you may have seen some rather extreme EQ curves for the reverb, with high-pass filters cutting the low end and so on. Totally fine for those genres, but none of that is going to happen here. Because the low end of a reverb carries a lot of the personality of the room. Instead, you might want to see if your reverb is adding annoying resonances and address those specifically with a targeted bell EQ. You'll be surprised how some very tiny adjustment in the region of 100 to 300 Hz can improve the overall clarity without denaturing the sound of your impulse response. If the reverb doesn't sound right, for example if it sounds boomy or if it doesn't make your violins lush enough, instead of EQing it aggressively, perhaps you should pick a different impulse response. Popular impulse responses for orchestral mixing are scoring stages, halls, sometimes chambers, and even churches. Algorithmic reverbs can be used in parallel to your main convolution reverb for when you need specific effects. I use them very sparingly on solo instruments and for things that require extra tail or extra smoothness. You can EQ your algorithmic reverb a bit more aggressively since you're not using it as your main room for the mix. References are your best friend here. Some orchestral mixes have a lot of reverb. Some other mixes are drier, which results in a more direct sound. Find some recordings that you really love the sound of and use those to gauge the amount of reverb in your mixes. Instrument placement is the result of 4 factors: reverb, EQ, panning, transient profile. If you're working with dry signals, you must place your instruments from scratch and create a sense of depth. In other words, your virtual stage is a blank canvas and you should position every instrument manually, making sure that some sections are behind other sections. If your instruments are wet, the software company has already done a lot of the work for you. But you might want to make small changes, moving things left to right or back to front on the stage. How do you do that? In order to push an instrument or section back, you need to increase its reverb send level and roll off some of the highs. That's because far instruments sound more muffled. You also need to make it slightly more centered, because our ears have a hard time locating far sounds, so hard panned sounds are perceived as closer. So if you're treating a whole section, you can use a stereo imager to make the section slightly narrower. If the instrument still sounds too close, you can roll off its attack. In this case, it's easier to use a transient designer instead of a compressor. Transient designers can also do the opposite for you. You can bring down the sustain of a source that has too much room baked in it and make it more upfront. When it comes to instrument placement, remember that small changes go a long way. One word about built-in reverbs, the ones that come with your virtual instruments. I said deactivate them before mixing, and I think it's a good idea for most projects. But if they sound alright and you're working on a quick mix, you can sometimes leave them on and skip the whole reverb phase, or just add a tiny bit of your own convolution reverb at the end. Not recommended for official mixes, but it can work for sketches or if you're on a tight deadline. Final touches for your mix are any additional effects that you might want to add. Saturation and distortion deserve particular attention. Talking about saturation and distortion, the first section that comes to mind is the brass. If your brass section sounds kinda flat or dull compared to the reference tracks, this is something you can address with a bit of saturation. Some brass libraries already have saturation baked in them. The second section that might benefit from this type of processing is the percussion, the drums especially. The thing with saturation is that it shouldn't be obvious. It should do its work without being noticed. Also, you have to be very intentional about it. You should use it deliberately to highlight important things. If it feels like everything needs saturation, then it's probably better to leave it for the mastering stage. Mixing is about creating contrast. Something needs to be quiet for something else to be loud. Something needs to be narrow for something else to be wide. Something has to be dark for something else to be bright. Something has to be dry for something else to be reverberated. Something has to be dull for something else to be snappy or upfront. Something has to be near for something else to be far. This is how you make space for everything, creating hierarchies around the important things for each segment of the tune, in a balance that changes all the time and evolves with the music, directing the listener's attention towards what matters the most. Layering is something that many composers do in order to make their sections fuller or in order to achieve a specific tone. Layering means blending samples from different libraries for the same instrument. So, for example, you could have the strings from two different companies doing the exact same thing, and you could blend them together so that the whole thing sounds more convincing or thicker. Live instruments can be used this way to make things even more expressive and real. Personally, I'm not a fan of layering. I only do it on occasion. I find it more convenient to pick exactly the patch that I need, and then I love to hear it for what it is. But I think you should be aware of the possibility of layering different libraries and experiment with this technique if you like. Headphones or speakers? What's best for mixing? If you have access to a treated room with the proper acoustics for mixing, then speakers are preferable. If you work in an untreated room, which is fair enough, even if you have the best speakers in the world, you're gonna have a hard time mixing. Your room, in fact, will absorb certain frequencies more than others, so you won't be able to identify and address problematic resonances, and you might end up cutting frequencies that don't require cutting. Mixing in an untreated room is entirely possible if you use headphones. Headphones introduce a few problems, but these problems can be fixed very easily. Headphones make you perceive the reverb a lot more. There's a risk that when you check your headphones mix with a pair of speakers, it's gonna sound dry. Also, headphones give you a great representation of the stereo image, which might in turn lead you to mix music that will sound narrow once you transfer it to the speakers. Both problems are solved by the use of references. The references will in fact tell you how wide your stereo image should be and how much reverb you need to dial in. Simple as that. Mixing with headphones can be tiring. You want to avoid ear fatigue by taking frequent breaks, or else you're going to make mistakes. You also want to avoid mixing too loud, otherwise you will be tempted to push things harder than they need to be. To summarize this module, spend some time finding the right reference tracks for your mix. Decide whether you're going to work with audio stems or keep the MIDI with all the samples running in the background. Balance your levels. Establish a clear volume hierarchy for each segment of the tune. Pan your instruments. Do any corrective EQ as well as any EQ that you might want to do for tonal control. Compress if needed for dynamic control and tonal shaping. Work on the reverbs and instrument placement. Add the finishing touches such as saturation and other effects. Remember that automations are your friends. Volume automations, panning automations, EQ automations, compression automations, and so on.